Looks pretty nice. Hey, what you doing?
I'm going fishing for big fish.
Oh, okay. What's with the weird lure thing?
Can you not understand English? I said I'm going fishing for big fish.
Oh, because you're fishing for big fish, you got a big lure. Is that it?
Yes, exactly. Big lures catch big fish.
No offense, but that looks ridiculous.
You're ridiculous.
Well, I don't have time to sit here and argue with you. I got things to do.
Hello everybody and welcome to Big Fishing Questions, the show where I answer your big fishing questions. The name is quite self-explanatory. Today's question is an age-old one. Does throwing a big lure equal a big fish? Well, it turns out the answer is kind of complicated. But first we have to understand forage. What is forage, you may ask? Forage is the food that is available to certain fish. For instance, forage for a largemouth bass may be crayfish, bluegill, shad, and frogs. Whereas the forage for, let's say, a bluegill would be small bugs and small minnows. Forage plays a huge role when it comes to fishing. You may have heard the term match the hatch. This is basically where you try to match the forage that is in a given body of water with the lure that you are throwing. Well, you may be asking yourself, Brendan, forage is great and everything, but what does it have to do with throwing big lures? Let's say you're fishing for brown trout in a nice rocky brook, and it just so happens there is a mayfly hatch when the flies are actually hatching out of the water. Now, the brown trout are feeding heavily on mayflies, which, keep in mind, are pretty small creatures in and of themselves. You show up at the river and you start throwing a large spinner to try and get some of these fish to bite. Chances are you're not going to catch a whole lot. Why? Because the brown trout at that time are honed in on mayflies, and that is their prime source of food at the time. So it would make sense to throw something that resembles a mayfly. This also has some merit when it comes to, say, bass fishing. If bass are feeding heavily on shad and they're schooling them into pockets, if you throw a jig down on the bottom, chances are you won't catch as many fish as you would if you were throwing, let's say, a square bill crankbait. Imitating forage can be very, very effective, whether that forage is really small like a mayfly or rather large like a big gizzard shad. There are, however, times when fish aren't honed in on a specific forage source, and then you can get away with throwing a wide variety of baits. So, back to the question at hand. Do big lures equal big fish? Well, I gotta say, from my own personal experience, I have caught plenty of big fish on just the opposite. Small lures, like this small crankbait right here. I caught a fish excess of 5 pounds with this tiny little bait. It is no secret that my family and I love to fish for steelhead. During the winter and the spring months, steelhead run up the tributaries out of Lake Erie, and we have a lot of fun fly fishing for them. Now, these steelhead can range anywhere from 3 pounds all the way up to 10-pound fish. But guess what we're catching them on? Little flies. As a matter of fact, I have found when I'm fishing heavily pressured bodies of water or I'm fishing in really tough fishing conditions, throwing small baits can yield fantastic results. So what does this mean? Does this mean every time you go out and throw small baits you're going to catch giant fish? No, I catch plenty of small fish on small baits. So we've seen that small baits can catch small fish and big fish. But where does this leave big baits? Well, chances are if you go to a lake and you spend a week throwing big swim baits or 10-inch worms, you will hook up with some decent sized fish. It makes sense. The bigger the fish is, the bigger its mouth is, and the bigger prey it can fit into its mouth. When you fish big baits, you have a higher chance of catching bigger sized fish because the smaller fish won't try to eat something so huge. But there are exceptions, of course. You see this spinner right here? Last summer I was out fishing a river trying to catch some northern pike with this spinner, and I ended up catching a smallmouth. This big. It was about the exact same size as the spinner, and this totally blew my mind. Why would a small fish attack such a big lure? So there are instances where tiny fish will bite big baits, but those are few and far between. Most of the time, if you go out throwing big baits, you're going to catch bigger fish. So what is the answer to the question, does throwing a big bait equal big fish? Well, like I said at the start, this answer is kind of complicated due to the fact that there are a lot of factors that come into play when we're talking about this particular subject. The first factor is forage type. Are the fish honing in on a specific type of forage? For instance, if they're feeding on 3-inch gizzard shad and you're throwing a 10-inch plastic worm, you'd probably do better off actually mimicking those smaller forage types. But again, there are instances where fish are not focused on one particular type of forage, and then you can get away with throwing all kinds of different stuff. When it comes down to it, given the proper scenario, big lures will most likely catch you big fish. But I would not underestimate small lures because, like I said, there have been times when these things have been dynamite. So there you go, guys. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Big Fishing Questions. For you older viewers, you might remember I actually did another episode of Big Fishing Questions a couple years ago. I decided recently that I wanted to kind of revamp the series, so hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you have any big fishing questions, be sure to leave them down in the comments below, and I'll try to answer them on the next episode. If you guys want to subscribe to the channel, you can do so here. If you want to check out my last video, you can do so here. And if you want to buy us some swim baits and support the channel, you can do so in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay hooked. I'll see you later. Does throwing a big lure equal a big fish? I mean, it would make sense. Try that again. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Big Fishing Questions, the show where I answer your big fishing questions. Today's question is an age-old one that has been talked about for... Today's question is... I got... Whereas forage for a bluegill may be small insects, tiny minnows, and aquatic creatures. Whereas forage for a bluegill would be small insects, whereas forage for a bluegill would be small whereas